Our speakers, I just want to tell you a little bit about the rules of the game. So this talk is part of a broader initiative which is called Manus America, which is partly an effort to bring MIT's experts to lead a conversation about the social and political and economic issues of our day. And it's very important to us that this not be a political platform. So we think that we're just bringing academic expertise to bear on these issues. So I'd like to ask you to make sure that questions are in that spirit. So for example, no jokes that presuppose that you're on one side of the aisle or another side. We're really here just to learn about the facts. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to introduce Adam Berinsky, who is a professor in the Political Science department, and Ezra Zuckerman, who is Siteman Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Sloan, and also Deputy Dean of Sloan. They each have produced a piece of super interesting research which is relevant to the politics of misinformation. So what we'll do is we'll hear from Adam first. He'll speak for about 8 minutes. And then Ezra, and then we'll start the conversation.
Excellent. Good. So, am I on there? Everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Awesome. Good. No? No. Well, is the mic on? Hello? Okay. Great. Okay, so it's nice to be here today. So I'm on leave this semester, so I'm more casual. So I apologize for that. But here today to talk about some work I've been doing the last few years, political rumors. So what are these kinds of rumors talking about? So perhaps you've seen this. This is one of my favorite things. One of my graduate students got me this. This is a campaign button from Obama in 2012. On the top is President Obama. On the bottom is his birth certificate. So you might recall there was some controversy about whether or not Obama was actually born in the U.S. and was eligible to be president. And this controversy spills over to opinion polls. So this is a poll that I did back in July of 2010, asking, do you believe that Barack Obama was born in the United States of America? 55% say yes. 27% say no, 19% say not sure, right? And this not sure is like, gosh, I don't know, but this is a skeptical not sure. And so what I've been doing over the last 7 or 8 years is studying the nature of misinformation in America, thinking about the kinds of rumors that spread, what can we do to correct them. So these are, so rumors are really interesting. They've been around forever. I was just talking to a journalist who said, is this something new? I said, well, rumors are not new. But what's new is how really widely they can spread. And so here this is evidently the source of Trump's claim that 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants casted votes in the 2016 presidential election. But in my work, I'm thinking about these kinds of questions, right? So 2 central questions. How is it that reasonable people, mostly reasonable people, can come to believe bizarre stories about our political system and the politicians who run it? And how can we correct that false information? So it's like chewing off a lot here. So everyone probably has friends and relatives who believe these kinds of bizarre stories. As I said, there's a long history. So I grew up in New York City in the 70s and 80s. And when I was there, this is how those stories spread. So I found this image. This was after the 1984 election. And you can see it said that Mondale and Reagan were in collusion to basically rig the election. Right? So there's nothing new here in how these rumors emerge. But what's new is how they spread. Right? It's a lot faster these days. So right, this is how rumors spread about illegal immigrants voting. Right? The president-elect saying, in addition, I would have won if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally, right? So something emerges on InfoWars, spread by the president, becomes a topic of national conversation, right? So kind of the technology has changed, and so the spread has changed. Now, the problem is that thinking about how to do this, so a lot of my work, sort of 8 minutes for an academic is like not even clearing the throat, so I'm not going to get into the details there. But the first part of my work looks at rumors like birthers, truthers, who believes them, looking at the structure of belief. And I think that the short answer there is that it's not that it's concentrated among a small group of individuals. So the line I use when I ask people about sort of 8 different rumors from across this political spectrum is that it's not that there's some people who believe a lot of crazy things. There's a lot of people that believe some crazy thing, right? And so 70% of the American public in my surveys endorse at least one of my conspiracies, and from across the left or the right. And it's only about 5% that will endorse them all, right? So there is this concentrated group of people who will believe a lot of rumors, right? So you can probably think of who that person is in your family at Thanksgiving, right, who has thing. But a lot of people will say, oh, no, that one's right. So when I've given this talk before, I say, here's a whole bunch of rumors, and someone will inevitably say, well, why is that one up there? All those other stories are crazy, but that one, right? Roswell aliens, birthers, like that's right. So the problem, and what I've been working on the last few years, is trying to correct these rumors, right? So correcting them is hard. There's a lot of work in psychology shows that rumors are sticky, and that a lot of things that we would do to try to correct rumors, in fact, can make things worse, right? So the intuitive thing is to say that here's the rumor, here's the fact, and once the information is out there, then the truth will win. Now, the problem is that in many cases, just by repeating the rumor, the corrections can backfire. In fact, it can make things worse, because over time, people forget that you gave them some information to tell them that it's not true. They just remember that that feels familiar, right? So there's been a lot of work done on, say, vaccine prevention, where you're trying to get people to get the flu vaccine, and you have a list of myths and realities, and people forget what's myth and what's reality, and they just say, oh, I just remember I heard that. Like the side effects are worse than the flu itself. So what can be done? And so the strategies that I've been focusing on, looking at specifically at correcting death panel rumors, right? This notion that the government has created sort of in the 2010 ACA provisions that enable people to have discussions with their doctors about how to end their life sooner, right? That this is something that is not true and is something that has been used to attack the ACA, is thinking about what we really want to focus on is source credibility, right? And thinking about getting the right person to correct that rumor. And so what I found is that partisanship plays a huge role. So Democrats are more likely to accept rumors about Republicans. Republicans are more likely to accept rumors about Democrats. And so kind of the thought is that if only we could get a neutral referee there to say, this is true, this is not, then that can solve it. It can transcend partisanship. The problem, though, is that we don't have these independent authorities today. So there's sites like Snopes.com, factcheck.org that will rate these. I think that in one of the promotions there, I think we had some of those one of those website meters and fact check, true or false. But the problem is that these are not necessarily seen as independent authorities. So my mother-in-law is a frequent conversation of my talks about rumors, is very plugged into the conservative rumor network. And so she would send me things about Obama, his birth certificate. So this is why, if you haven't heard, just Google Obama birth certificate. You can see that he's used anywhere from 4 to 14 different Social Security numbers in the course of his lifetime, including one that belonged to someone from Connecticut who died in the 1960s. Right? So this is, again, she sends me these stories. I say it's not true. Here's this Snopes.com link that explains why it's not true. And it worked for a while, but then about 2 years ago she said, I was talking to my friends and they say Snopes is a liberal website, so I'm just not going to believe anything anymore. Right? So people are looking for, the analogy I use is that people are looking for a referee, but we're playing street basketball. Right? That there's no one that's going to come in and say this is true, this is not. And here partisanship can play a big role. So in my work I find if you have an unlikely source, in this case Republicans saying that death panels don't exist, then that can work, right? Another analogy I use is thinking about McDonald's. So about 10 or 15 years ago, McDonald's stopped selling supersized fries. And so you think that this is something that is an effective source, right? So if McDonald's, which makes its money by selling fries, no longer sells huge amounts of fries, then maybe you shouldn't be eating huge amount of fries. So it's this unlikely source that's most credible, not an independent source. And that's the problem, is that it's hard to find these kinds of sources, that people are looking for independent sources, but it doesn't really exist. So you really need to find these people who will speak against their own interests. And then in the work, this paper that I've published, I find that these corrections do work, but that they fade very quickly. So the lessons from my research, just kind of very quickly, is, it's kind of a depressing set of findings. And so, it's sort of like this is, I think Agustín said something that we're going to talk about how to solve the problem of misinformation. I think at the very best, I can maybe not make it so much worse. So I found lots of ways to make things worse, not many to make it better, but there are some things. And I think, again, the idea is thinking about the strategies that can be successful, right? So from my research, I say that you don't want to repeat misinformation even to correct it, right? And so it's thinking about presentationally. So if Trump says 3 to 5 million people voted illegally for my opponent, you don't lead the article with that. You lead with saying, given today's voting systems, it is almost impossible to have more than a handful of illegal immigrants voting in an election. And then by the fourth paragraph, you say Trump says this, right? Lead with the truth rather than repeating the lie and then trying to counter that. Finding an alternative narrative. Happy to talk a little bit about this if people have questions. That basically, it's not just enough to say this is not true. You need someone to give them another narrative that they can lock onto. But I think the most important is finding a credible source to counter that misinformation, right? That non-political isn't the most effective. So my stories having the AMA or the AARP say that these weren't true was not half as effective as having a Republican politician saying this is crazy. Because in today's partisan time, there's nothing that is actually non-political. So thank you.
So it's tough to feedback. It's tough to follow Adam, given how compelling the presentation was, but also because I'm still recovering from the news that Mondale did not apparently conspire with Gore. I mean, with Reagan to swing the 1984 election. So you'll forgive me. So I'm here today because my co-authors and I, I'm up there, so Oliver Hall, who's a MIT Sloan doctoral alum, and Min Jae Kim, who's a current doctoral student here at MIT Sloan. So we were as bewildered as anyone by the 2016 presidential election. The specific puzzle that we were focused on related to something we'd actually done a lot of research on in the last few years in social and economic contexts, but nothing prepared us for what we were seeing in the political context. Right? And the question we were generally interested in is how and why we reward some people and producers for being more, quote, authentic than others. But the puzzle we were seeing in the political context was how it is we can be excited about a candidate even though, there's the question, even though they act like a lying demagogue. And you might say even stronger, especially because, maybe that we actually find them appealing and authentic, especially because they act like a lying demagogue. Defined, in this case, as someone who repeatedly and deliberately makes false statements, and who stokes popular prejudices while flagrantly violating basic norms. Okay? Now, as I should say, as we looked into this question, there's a deeper question at some level, which is how it is that we find any politician ever as authentic. Right? Now, to be sure, on the one hand, right, so we think about how our democratic system works. Well, politicians, our political leaders are our agents. Right? And so it's natural that if we define authenticity, there it is as it is claimed to be, right, or he or she is as they claim themselves to be. It's natural that we should be looking for authenticity in our political leaders, right? How can we trust them if they are not who they claim themselves to be? However, The very nature of politics, if you think about it, right, so requires you to mobilize a disparate coalition of voters, and so it's natural that you're going to be varying your message depending on time and place. And then in the context of where it turns out there are some benefits for holding political office, and so you might have, ulterior motive or two, it's natural that that inconsistency where you're varying your message breeds suspicion, such that perhaps you're not particularly authentic. Now, given all that, it's particularly surprising, right, that we might view a candidate who is basically repeatedly and deliberately makes false statements and who flagrantly violates norms, perhaps while stoking popular prejudices, as being particularly authentic. All right. Now, one very good explanation for what's going on, or at least for a part of what's going on, I think is presented by Adam and some of his colleagues. And that is particular that partisans tend to be highly motivated to believe statements made by their candidates. Right? And so what you have then is an image, and the image is of two worlds, two very different worlds, maybe troublingly different worlds, in which in each world you believe your own candidate and what they say, even when it sort of beggars belief. Right, and challenges deeply held assumptions. But you think the other candidate is lying through his or her teeth. Right? Now, this explanation certainly explains some of what we saw in this past election and in other elections as well. And in a post-election survey that we conducted just a week after the election, we find supporting evidence for it as well. But we also show that there's another important part to the story. Now, one reason we wanted to look further is that it's otherwise hard to account for very important asymmetry that we saw in this past election and that we see in many other elections as well. In particular, whereas Trump supporters saw him as highly authentic, Clinton supporters did not see Hillary Clinton as particularly authentic. We see this in our data, and it's more generally true. Okay? So if it's just that we're motivated to believe, right, what our candidate says, this asymmetry is puzzling. If we're motivated to like our candidate and to hate the other candidate, right, that asymmetry is puzzling as well. Now, we also found, here we are, right, that we found in that post-election survey that on the one hand, Trump supporters, people who voted for Trump, found him to be highly authentic, but they also said that he was not likable, was not sincere, and was not considerate or warm. Okay? In short, they viewed him and were enthusiastic about him for being an authentic jerk. Essentially is the view. That's not our term, but it basically summarizes those results. Okay? Finally, well, we find that Trump supporters are much more likely than Clinton supporters to believe a famous false statement of Trump's. That is, that I'll have it up there in a second, that the Chinese invented climate change in order to, wreak economic havoc in America. Right? The difference is really only because there's absolutely no Clinton supporters who believe that statement, and a few Trump supporters actually believed it, but relatively few. All right? And that result, I think, is consistent with what's been a theme in our various Men's and Manus America events that we've had, and I see Christine Wally here, and we had Arlene Hochschild, which is that there's rationality on both sides of America's political divide. Okay? But that also just sharpens our puzzle, right? So how is it that a candidate can seem authentically appealing, that is, appealing because he seems authentic, or she seems authentic, even though his very supporters actually regard him as a lying demagogue? So our survey results suggest an answer. Right? See a little bit summarized up there. We found that roughly half of Trump supporters said that Trump's statement, and presumably others like that statement, the statement that the Chinese invented climate change, was a form of symbolic protest against the establishment. And these people, who also said, don't take this statement seriously, don't take it literally, sorry, were particularly enthusiastic about Trump. Those are the people who are particularly enthusiastic for him. All right. But how is all this rational? Right? How can we see, this is the big question, how can we see a liar as authentic and trust that candidate, a political leader, to represent us? Now, in thinking about this question, we realize that it is really important to distinguish between two different kinds of lies, okay? As depicted in the following slide. Okay? Usually, when we worry about politicians' lies, the concern derives from the fact that the politician has special access to particular pieces of key information about their interests, about their relationship, about their financial positions, etc. All right? So here are two notorious, where they are, two notorious special access lies to give you a sense of what we mean. One from Bill Clinton, right? I did not have sexual relations with that woman, and the other by George Herbert Walker Bush, who clearly was lying about what he was willing to do, and he was willing to raise taxes, and he said, read my lips, no new taxes. Very famous special access lies. Okay? But we'd like to suggest there's another kind of lie, right? One useful distinction you might make on lies, what we call a common knowledge lie. Okay? This is a deliberately false statement made when the speaker is not presumed to have special access to the relevant information. Right? And therefore, the speaker is likely to know that the hearer will likely doubt the statement, maybe even really believe it, disbelieve it. Right? The speaker actually expects the audience to disbelieve that statement. Right? And so here are two lies of Donald Trump, one that I put up before about the Chinese inventing the internet we used before, and another one about, Arabs in Jersey City cheering as the World Trade Center came down. What's key about those lies is that no one presumes that Donald Trump has any special information about that. It's not about him, it's not about his relationships, etc. That's what we call a common knowledge lie. Right? Here's, by the way, a whopper of Hillary Clinton's, which we would submit as somewhere in the middle between a special access lie and a common knowledge lie, this one about the email server. All right. Now, common knowledge lies are really strange if you think about them. Right? It's the reason why, if you actually look in the literature, people don't usually think about these kinds of lies as being the ones the politicians might make, or the ones we might think about and worry about. We argue that a speaker can use a common knowledge lie to do something very subtle and potentially powerful. What she can do is she can invite her listeners to come along with her in violating norms in general, some basic norms, and in particular, the norm about truth-telling, that you should tell the truth. Right? Now, then the question becomes for us, which is, why might we ever accept such an invitation? Well, in many circumstances, we are not so happy with the norms we feel we must comply with. We feel like they are imposed upon us by, quote, the establishment, rather than freely chosen by us. In such cases, we might be eager for a leader who is willing to proclaim that the emperor has no clothes, to speak truth about power, the illegitimate use of power, at least in our eyes. So on the one hand, we actually might recognize that the lying demagogue is not telling the truth. But on the other hand, we appreciate his willingness to provoke the outrage of the hated establishment, an establishment that we ourselves hate, by proclaiming a deeper truth that has been suppressed by the establishment that we hate. So in the last couple of months, we've been doing a couple of experiments in devising this argument. In devising these tests, it's been important for us to take a bunch of really important factors, and factors that no doubt are important in this election and other elections as well, off the table, and see whether we can explain what's going on just with what I suggested to you before. So gender. Right? It could be that we see female politicians as less authentic than male politicians. That's possible. Language. Right? It's possible that different groups of people define truth or authenticity in different ways. Culture. Right? It's possible that different sides of the partisan divide have different beliefs about politics. And information. Right? It could be that we're exposed to different information, different narratives, and therefore that's the reason why we want to take that. We took that all off the table. All right? And the key was to take it to summarize, the key was to take it out of the context of this past year's election, right? And see if we can get Americans of various types, men and women, Clinton supporters and Trump supporters, to find a lying demagogue authentically appealing or not, depending on whether their simulated social group, that is a social group that they are made to feel a member of in our experiment, depending on whether they think their simulated social group is being unfairly treated by the political establishment. Create conditions that political sociologist Seymour Martin Lipson called a legitimacy crisis. We actually simulated two different kinds of legitimacy crises, one in which a group outside the political process felt they were being betrayed by a self-serving political class, and one in which a former group of insiders felt they were being betrayed by a political establishment that was favoring an upstart social group. Now, I don't have time to get into a detailed rundown of those experiments. But I want to show you the statement that our lying demagogue made in a simulated college election. Right, so there's a statement in blue, there's a statement in red, or whatever that is, purple. And the statement in purple is a pretty ugly statement. The context is in a simulated college election, like I said, in which the key issue was whether they should ban alcohol on campus, which is actually a very salient issue today in America's college campuses. And this is the statement of sort of of a candidate who was opposed to the ban. And he says, oh, the statement is based on research that wasn't peer-reviewed. And he also says, the ugly statement at the bottom, which is sort of outrageous and misogynistic. Okay? And what we had in each of these experiments is paired with this statement. And by the way, this is a lie. In some conditions, the subjects know the research actually was peer-reviewed. And the key contrast is with a set of conditions in which, again, a candidate who's opposed to the alcohol ban, and he says that the research wasn't peer-reviewed, but actually in this case it really was not. I'm sorry, it says it was not peer-reviewed. In fact, it was not peer-reviewed, so he's telling the truth, and he doesn't make any kind of outrageous statements. Okay? That's the key contrast. What we find is that when subjects are experimentally made to think that they're members of a social group that's being unfairly treated in each of the way by the political process, in each of the way that I described before, they tend to prefer this guy, right, the previous guy, the lying demagogue, and see him as appealing and support him more than they see this guy. And it doesn't matter if they're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if they're a Clinton supporter or a Trump supporter in those experiments. Okay? I look forward to discussing the significance of this research and how it relates to atoms and how it can further our understanding of our common political challenges. For us, though, the headline, there it is that appreciation for lying demagoguery is not surprising once we realize that roughly half of America perceives the political establishment here to be stacked against it. And then I guess the question is why this is and what we can do about it.
So I have a very quick question for Ezra, and then I'll give Adam a chance to engage with him if he wants, and then we'll switch, and I'll ask Adam a question, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So here's a very quick question, and I take this to be supportive of your view. So I'm reminded of Harry Frankfurt's famous short book on bullshit,
right.
Where he describes the bullshitter as playing a different game. So it's not when one bullshits, one is exactly lying, because he thinks that when you lie, you're playing the truth game and you're breaking the rules. Instead, you're just playing a game where you're not bound to truth. So there is no breaking the rules when you say things that are untrue. So I wonder whether something that makes it even easier to like the lying demagogue is that maybe you don't think of them as the lying demagogue at all. You think of them as a bullshitting demagogue.
So I agree with that. So right. So I think you do recognize. I think what we see, people are recognizing that say the candidate that we talk about as a lying demagogue is insincere. But yeah, I think that's the whole key. We refer to Frankfurt in the actual paper. I didn't want to use the word bullshit here today, even though Trump is famously quoted as saying when they built Trump Tower, give them the old Trump bullshit is some famous quote. For us, I think it's right. So that probably eases things. Is that this notion that Selena Zito, a columnist for The Atlantic, made famous, right? That Peter Thiel claims he said it first, or something like that. I don't know, right? That the media, or maybe the left, took Trump literally, but not seriously, right? That his supporters took him. In some sense, all we're doing is finding evidence for that and working out the logic of that. And then what our contribution, I think, is being able to turn that on or off. Right, and so it's not, fine, that happens, but what's the logic of it, and then under what conditions might we see that kind of thing? And then we can show that it happens in a situation where you're in a social group and you're finding the system is essentially stacked against you. And we've got two different versions of that, but so I think that probably facilitates things for sure.
Adam, do you want to comment on that?
I think just the only thing I want to say is that I think But so what's interesting is that my work has been focused mainly on policies, and I think I've done some work as well on candidates. I think that it aligns very nicely with Ezra's work here. In terms of, I did some studies of Trump that if we correct things that he said was wrong, it affects people's willingness to believe them, though that effect fades over time, but does nothing to affect his level of support or not. So if you correct misinformation, it doesn't change whether or not people support him. So I think that's kind of convergent way there, but I do think it's important to think about differences between evaluating people and evaluating policies and the role that misinformation plays there, because I think that one is more dangerous than the other, but it's sort of thinking about misinformation about policies, but if we kind of get down the slippery slope, then I think that there's potential problems there. Because I never thought in my lifetime I would see a candidate who said things that you can actually literally roll tape to say that these are things, so that the line used about China. You can actually roll tape to see he's saying that, and I thought that that would be something that would kill a candidate. I'm old enough to remember when Biden was accused of plagiarism in, I think it was 1988, that ended his campaign, but obviously not his political career, and that this is just sort of one louder. So I think there's a lot there. Yeah, no one has a happy story here, I think, is this, but I think that some stories, potentially more dangerous than others.
So here's a quick question for Adam. So you ended with a slide you described as depressing, though illuminating, to be sure. And when I listened to your talk, I just wondered whether it was even more depressing for the following reason. So at the start you mentioned that rumors spread more easily now, just because of the media we have, the ability to reach many, many people. But I wonder whether there's not an additional factor that creates a perfect storm, and that's that also the world is more polarized. So the very solution to the rumors, which you mentioned, namely having people on the side that would benefit from the rumor, are less willing to come out and speak. So if you're a news organization, it's not that you don't want to cite the relevant people in trying to diffuse the rumor, it's that it's harder to find them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, so great. That's it. So even more depressing. It's just, I think it's good. I thought it was a pretty depressing story to begin with, but I completely agree with that. And it just, I think that kind of the big point I want to take, this is when I talk to the Democratic Congressional Caucus about it. So basically, that things that you think are answers are not answers. I think that's really the first step, is that looking for this outside authority that doesn't exist is, I think, really important to get people sort of off that track, because people are saying the facts are going to speak for themselves, and that just clearly doesn't happen. But on the slightly more hopeful note, that there are still politicians who are interested in truth, and so the quotes that I used in my stories about Republican politicians saying that the death panels are false were actual quotes. So I remember presenting this to a journalist and saying, here's a solution or a solution, and they said, good luck finding that. I was like, no, but this is a real quote, and I think, again, kind of finding those people, highlighting that is important. But I think just as important is recognizing that what looks to be the solution that most people go to is, citing authority, finding independent authorities. I think you see this in terms of the climate science debate, that just because someone's an MIT scientist who says this is the truth doesn't mean that people are going to accept it. I think that as scientists, as the people, that we have a hard time accepting that, but I think it's very important to do that and crafting strategies accordingly. So I think, even if it is more depressing, at least it's more realistic, and to think that people think that there are these easy solutions that just don't exist.
Yeah, that's very illuminating. Ezra, would you like to comment on Anna's work?
Sure. So I do think there's really interesting points of convergence, maybe particularly around that resistance to correct information. Misinformation and the support is unabated, and so there's something kind of deep there that's resisting that, and is maybe looking for multiple ways to potentially justify things that are at odds with what we see, and one of them is to believe things that should beggar belief, and the other is perhaps to say, yeah, that's not what's important. It's some underlying, some implicit claim that's being made about the system, something like that. I guess I'm wondering, maybe this is a touchy question to ask about. You talk about things as fairly symmetric across, say, America's political divide. Is that accurate? Or do you see asymmetries in say, in Democrats and Republicans or conservative?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of work on this. So a lot of what we've seen over the last few years are rumors, from the right about the left, so Obama citizenship. And there's some views that John Jess, your former colleague, has made the case that there's a conservative way of thinking that kind of lines up with this. And in fact, there are some personality characteristics. So dogmatism is associated with increased belief in conspiracy theories and rumors, also with political conservatism. But I think, that a lot of what we've studied has been in this time of, with a Democratic president. And I'm already seeing it sort of, some of my friends who are on the left saying, but what about, about the Russians hacking voting machines to give the election to Trump, right? And so, well, that's not a story. That's something that's been debunked effectively, but yet they believe this. And I think as we're entering this era of Republican dominance of government, I think that we're going to be seeing more and more kind of rumors on the left. So I think, it's hard to say, was it personality or was it the politics? And now that we're kind of shifting the politics, there's a book by some folks at University of Miami, and their argument that conspiracy theories are for losers, not losers as in, like my 12-year-old son would call them, but, losers as in political losers, right? That those are the people who do this, and they look at about 100 years of American history that that's the case. So I guess I've said this beforehand, that this time's bad for democracy but good for business, and so I think it would be an interesting time over the next few years to see what happens as the rhetoric shifts.
So I'd now like to open up the conversation. Yes, go ahead.
Can I ask a question about authentic? You use the terms. They use the term in terms of truth and falsity. And I wonder if, with this particular election, I'm sorry to bring up Trump, but I wonder if his being called authentic by his supporters has something to do not with truth, but by his willingness to say what he thinks. And that could be right or wrong, but because he's willing to say something that is offensive when it's offensive, because he's willing to say whatever's on his mind, he then is one of us, because he doesn't hide behind political correctness, one of those other terms that was so divisive in this election. And that the authenticity people are talking about is the fact that he just says what he thinks. And politicians don't do that, and that's repression.
Yeah. So that's consistent with what I presented to you. I think it's a little more specific, right, in that it's not simply what he thinks. Because, like, if you think about the experiments I showed you, right, the guy who was not being outrageous was also saying what he thought, presumably. I mean, it's particularly that he's willing to actually, poke a stick in the eye of the establishment and say things that are, outrageous. I mean, he goes so far as to say things. You think about, you said you never thought someone would say, things that were clearly demonstrably false. That's among the things that's going on. But also breaking norms that have never been broken before. I mean, the history of the nation state. I submit to you that, the number of, viable candidates who called out, POWs as potentially cowards, that's not a long list of people, right? And so you've got norms that are just being, but the key is there too, is that there's a signal that I'm basically willing to poke a stick in the eyes of the establishment. In that case, the Republican establishment, right? And that's the signal. We haven't tested this, but our view, my co-authors and I, is that Trump is a uniquely, is a sort of an exquisite vehicle for this, because he's been persona non grata among the the cultural elite for a generation and more, right? And he can go out there and credibly say, maybe I'm not. He says he's for them. He's certainly not representing the establishment. And so all that stuff does is it kind of primes for that message that I am, I'm basically the unwashed masses just like you.
Yeah, I mean authentic in the sense of being oneself as opposed to telling or not telling the truth.
Yeah, or being one of them or something like that. Yeah, or being for them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This is kind of to Adam's research. So you mentioned that one of the best ways to break these are by unexpected sources. So if like a Republican says something against a Republican candidate, it's like, oh well, I'm more likely to believe that because they're Republican, and there may be some truth to that now that we're so polarized, Republicans and Democrats. But given that there are fractions even within each party, you think, are you progressive or are you just like a mainline Democrat? Are you with the Tea Party or not? Is that circle of people who are believable getting even smaller? Because you think of people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain who came out and said, disparaging things about Trump. Certainly anyone who ran against him directly, like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, they would, be roundly rejected in the general election. Is that circle getting even smaller? Like, would it have to be Trump himself come out and say, it's like, oh, what I said was incorrect? I mean, how small, is that circle getting smaller, do you think?
Well, I think that I would, I'd say that the thing to do is not to say just sort of like, oh, the specific example I gave was a Republican saying this, death panels are not true. But I think just kind of finding broader sources of credibility. I think people need to get creative, right? So like the McDonald's example about French fries, right? So I think that's the case. So I think just having Republicans say, oh, that this is not true, is something that might not always, as you say, be an effective strategy. I mean, that said, we haven't seen a lot of that. We sort of, I think about what John McCain has said. If you actually dig into what he's saying about Trump, and this is post-Republican primary, kind of when you had the consolidation, there were a number of Republicans who, after the tape of Trump, talking about the things that he did, sort of spoke against him personally, but that faded very quickly. But you think about specific policies and sort of lies saying that there just isn't a lot of that. So, but that said, I don't really have the solution. So when I've given this talk, that anyone who comes to tell you, like, here's the 3 easy things that you can do to correct misinformation, just don't listen to them, because it's a hard problem. When I went to the Democrats, I said, like, people are going to come to tell you this, and it's going to be very compelling, but just don't listen, because if it were that easy, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. But it's kind of, people are hardwired this way. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but just kind of being creative and thinking about, like, who is the person who has credibility in this situation. So I've been doing some work also with with different organizations, thinking about how can we increase vaccine in the uptake. There's a story that there's a link between vaccines and autism, which is there's no scientific basis for that. And so you can have scientists saying that, but they said, like, well, maybe they're just in the pocket of big pharma. But if you have parents of people who have children with autism who say there's no basis for this, or the example that I've been trying to work with is mothers who didn't get the flu shot during their pregnancy and ended up having problems because of that, saying, like, those are the people who are credible. So again, it's just, that's just one example, but I think thinking more creatively is people speaking out against their interests are the most credible, or their parent interests. Yeah.
Can I want to ask Adam something related to what you just said, which is, I don't know that I agree that people are hardwired for this. Like, I think in a psychological sense. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that people apparently have the ability, right? So yes, we're hardwired to potentially be in this mode. But I guess I see, maybe this is the sociologist in me talking, as being structural, mm-hmm. and that there's a particular illness in the structure of a lot of liberal democracies today, mm-hmm. that lends itself to this. And then I see, like, each of the 2 things that we're talking about as being manifestations of that structural problem. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm hopeful for a world in which somehow we actually, break through some of what sort of structurally divides us. Mm-hmm. And then, so if conspiracy theories are a symptom of people feeling, people on the one hand having voice, and maybe with modern technologies having some sense of voice, but feeling very little sense of efficacy and being represented by the system, that you know, if somehow we can address that, then the willingness to believe or the willingness to believe either in misinformation or in, you know, in dog whistles of various kinds will somehow. But maybe that's just the optimist in me. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess that I tend, people who know me, I'm not the most optimistic person. So I think that there are some point that there's kind of some basic structure, and that people are more or less predisposed to believe conspiracy theories. So it's not all Democrats who believe that George Bush fixed the 2004 election, but it's Democrats who tend towards conspiratorial thinking who are able to. So that's the part I didn't show about that. So, you know, but there's two elements there, right? Kind of part is what we're hardwired for, and the second is what the system can do. And I think if politicians were better about kind of calling out misinformation, that'd be good. So another part of what I've been looking at is how do politicians talk about this. So with Obama's citizenship, Republicans, so Trump would come out and say, you know, I don't believe this. That was rare among Republican politicians, but what a lot of them said is, I don't believe this, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion, right? And so that's the problem kind of structurally. So I would say that I think that you're right that that's part of this, but I mean, just given how, you know, sort of rumors and folklore have been spread for, you know, hundreds of, you know, thousands of years, that I think that people are sort of hardwired to kind of disseminate this. But that said, there are structural things, so kind of targeted corrections or something. But I think the one that comes to mind most often, again, the thing I keep pushing it back against, is finding this independent referee of the truth who's going to come in and say, aha, this is truth, this is not truth. Because sort of any expert that I talk to says, well, the solution, of course, is expertise. And I think the problem is, especially in today's society, is that there is no independent source of expertise that everyone can agree, yes, this is the fact.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to just ask about this question of left and right and partiality to rumors. An interview that I heard with someone who created fake news stories during the last election. And he said he began creating fake news stories to support Hillary Clinton, and Democrats would not bite. He couldn't get any clicks. They didn't go viral. And so he started creating fake news stories against Hillary Clinton. And that he really, you know, they took off. People, the right-wing people, believed everything. And that really impressed me. And I know you said that, you know, there are some, you know, characteristics of right-wing people, but it doesn't seem symmetrical. Also, this question of expertise, which you raised, I really think that you would find, you know, left and right, that people on the left would be more accepting of expertise and not require that it be, you know, I mean, if they read a peer-reviewed report that autism, you know, was not caused by vaccines, you would probably find more would believe that, and maybe even not impressed with a mother of an autistic child saying, you know, she doesn't believe it, and therefore you shouldn't believe it either. So, you know, it just seems to me there are just differences. And
let me start with the last statement you said. Is sort of your supposition is reasonable but incorrect. So that in terms of this vaccine autism link, it's believed across the spectrum, and so there is in both liberal and conservative communities. So. So the statistic I like to say a lot, so my children are in Cambridge public schools, and we get a list of all the schools in Cambridge, both public and private, and the vaccination rates. And the highest vaccination rates are at the lowest SES schools, and the lowest vaccination rates are at the private schools, and then the second lowest is the Tobin Montessori, which is, you know, sort of a magnet for folks in Cambridge. So I think I bring that just to say that the vaccine autism link is a case where, in some cases, it could be that people on the left might even be more acceptant of that particular rumor than folks on the right. So I think a lot of it is just circumstance. So I think it's really an open question at this point about the link between conservatism, liberalism, and the willingness to accept rumors. And like I said, I think the coming years are going to be a real test of that, to see what emerges. And just kind of my just kind of scouting my social media world, there's a lot of rumors coming from the left right now, especially people who are big supporters of Sanders, about not just about Clinton, but about Trump, about the system more generally. And so I think that we'll see a little bit more of that, but I think it really is an open question about this.
Well, I'm just wondering about the concept of confirmation bias, because I know that there's a lot of research that shows we do all seek information that confirms what we want to believe. And journalists are increasingly aware of this bias. And in the organization I worked for before I worked at MIT Facing History, which works with high school students and middle school students, they did a lot of research around the news media of the Ferguson, Missouri, events around the shooting of Michael Brown. And they were able to show photographs and media that confirms biases in any way you want to look at it. Police photographs, beating Michael Brown photographs, whatever you wanted to confirm your bias in that story is there, and in all different kinds of media that you wouldn't expect. And so I guess the optimistic part is if you can teach at a fairly young age how to determine implicit bias and confirmation bias and these different kinds of things, maybe at some point people will be at least a little more aware. I don't know. Are you still?
Well, I think there's a lot of where people are looking at media literacy, and so I've been talking to different groups who are very interested in this, and I think it is really important. Sort of the college sort of analog is telling my students that Wikipedia is not okay to have as the only source for your research paper, right? And so, this is for faculty in the room, right? This is a fight we have every day with students. And so I think doing that, is important, kind of critical skills. But I guess that, given the political environment, especially where people can much more easily find, so it's not just the spread of rumors, that people can more easily find fragmented media that comports with their views, I think is important. Now, the happy story, I guess, there is in another project that I've been working on, looking at media self-selection and this information bubble, is that most people, most of the time, don't really care about politics. And if you give them a choice, they would rather watch entertainment or sports than politics. And so I think, in some cases, this notion of the media bubble is overblown, that it does accurately portray kind of the core political junkies on the left and the right, but most of, that there's hope in that most of the people don't want to be in these bubbles because they don't care about politics, that they would like to know something about the election, but they're not gravitating to Fox News or MSNBC, right? They're gravitating toward non-news options, and so there is a window to be able to reach people.
Professor Sobey.
So, given what you just said, and that most people are not interested in politics most of the time, I wonder if you would address the material conditions of the American people for the last 30, 40 years that might have laid a foundation for this. Do you think that's relevant?
I mean, it goes back to so I'm a survey research guy, and so I think that from the early days of survey research, we learned, going back to the 1940s, that people don't pay much attention to politics and don't know much about politics. So I think that's a constant of the human condition. But I don't know if Ezra, if you have anything to add to that, or.
But I missed how that relates. You're saying...
It relates to the fact that if everybody is partisan, and most of the time they don't care about politics, yes, we have the technology to spread rumors faster than the New York, whatever you had there about Mondale and Reagan. So they spread further. How do they vote? I thought that the political scientists used to say, and I'm out of date, that they vote on